Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's graduation ceremony. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which this ceremony takes place. And I especially welcome those of you who have supported our graduates, particularly those of you who are watching our live stream around the world who can't be with us today. And I want to tell you something of the meaning of this ceremony and the part that you play in it. These colourful gowns and bonnets and hoods all have their own place and histories in its tradition, a tradition which continues to salute, in particular, three powerful ideas: academic freedom, fearless inquiry, and the uncompromising quest for excellence. The idea of academic freedom, that we should be able to debate and discuss and teach and learn without fear of coercion, arose with the medieval universities that emerged in Europe at the end of what we now call the Dark Ages. The ideas of pursuing the truth and the passion for excellence can be traced much further back to Plato's school in Athens 2,500 years ago. Plato named his famous school the Academy after the Athenian hero Academus. And it may surprise you to learn that many tutorials here are still taught according to the Socratic method of inquiry named after Plato's famous teacher, Socrates. As a graduate of this, one of the great universities of the world, you automatically become part of that ancient and noble tradition. And why, you may well ask, should that be of any importance to you in 2018? Well, it's important because the threads that hold civil society together are remarkably fragile and easily broken, as you can see by looking at the conflict and upheaval in the world around us. And while we are fortunate in this country to avoid much of the violent conflict, the unravelling of the threads can occur through neglect or reckless disregard. Just 2 years ago, we had scarcely heard the phrases of fake news or alternative facts. And now the very legitimacy of objective truth and evidence-based science is being questioned, if not being under attack. The threads will also fray when leaders and people who ought to know better behave as though the truth is optional, or when they allow vulgarity and rudeness and racial targeting to creep into mainstream political discourse. Indeed, it was Socrates who wisely observed 2,500 years ago that bad manners are the beginning of chaos. It is our university traditions of independent thought and pursuit of the truth and that passion for excellence that provide much of the glue that binds these delicate threads of civil society together, as they have done through countless conflicts, depressions, despots, disasters, and demagogues, through the birth and death of nation-states, empires, and through previous eruptions of populist fervour for 1,000 years. That's why it's important. That's why so many of your faculty have given up their morning to be with you on this special day. And to the parents and partners and family members who have supported our graduates, that's why your contribution is so important, not only to the graduate in your life, but to the very health of our civil society. And on behalf of the university, I thank you. Some people think the reason for studying here is to secure a mere qualification, a meal ticket or a passport to self-enrichment. And indeed, it can be all of those things. But your ancestors at the Academy, from Justinian to Owen Dixon, from Hippocrates to Christian Barnard, from Michelangelo to Zaha Hadid, they would say the real purpose of having been here is to gain a glimpse of the life you could live, enriched and inspired by the wisdom and insights of those who have preceded you across 25 centuries. It is to invite you to consider forging a life where you make a difference, where you pull your weight as a citizen, where you take the skills you've acquired here and use your learning to make a positive contribution to the world. I will shortly commence admitting you to the rank and privileges of your degree, and you'll be entitled to place the letters of your degree after your name, and the University of Melbourne becomes forevermore your alma mater, which in Latin means something like nurturing mother. And like a nurturing mother, the university is keenly interested in your progress, and we ask that you stay in touch through our alumni network around the world. Should you choose the path of making a difference, you will find the university community an enduring source of encouragement, inspiration and support. Now, I have no way of knowing who among you will choose that path, but I'm quite certain that many of you will, and it is therefore an honour for me to confer your degree today. I congratulate you all on your achievement, and wherever life's journey takes you, your university wishes you well. I call on the Provost, Professor Mark Considine, to introduce Robert Pradolin, who has kindly agreed to deliver the occasional address.
This morning we're fortunate to have as guest speaker a significant figure in the housing industry, Mr. Robert Pradolin. Robert's an engineer by background. He graduated with honours from Monash University and later earned a postgraduate diploma in property from RMIT and an MBA from Mount Eliza Management College. He's been active in the property industry for over 30 years, most recently as General Manager of Fraser's Property Australia, formerly known as Australand. Robert has a keen interest in the development of all types of housing and in particular a focus on housing affordability. Indeed, a proud achievement of his time with Fraser's Australand has been steering the company into the social and affordable housing space. Robert believes that the principle housing for all, rich and poor, reflects both a fundamental human need and the best long-term interest of the economy. He has extensive relationships within the property industry and among many industry bodies he's been involved with. He's currently on the board of the Salvation Army Housing Victoria, the Property Industry Foundation and the Housing Industry Association in Victoria. He's also a past board member of the Property Council of Australia, Livable Housing Australia and the Heritage Council of Victoria. He's also involved with housing research and policy development with the University of Melbourne. It's a pleasure to ask him to address us today, and please make welcome Mr. Robert Pradolin.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to say how honoured and humbled I feel to be asked to speak to you on such a symbolic day, your graduation. In thinking about today, and especially walking through the gardens this morning when I saw you and your families, I recall some of the emotions I felt and the pride my parents particularly felt in seeing me, the first of their 4 children, graduate from university. I was the only male and the eldest of 4 children. My parents migrated to Australia from Italy in the early 1950s, leaving behind a life and culture they knew and loved, never having had the opportunity to have any form of formal education. As a result, my father was determined that we would all go to university, and he set about making sure we did exactly that. Education, especially achieving a university degree, was something that he was never able to aspire to. He wanted all his children to have what he considered to be an amazing opportunity so that we could all live a better life than he and Mum had had. And in his view, education was the key. I remember my father making a statement that left an indelible impression in my mind. As a young man in Europe during the Second World War, he knew of many families who have had their assets seized by the invading army, and he was always concerned that one day it might happen to him or his family. And even though he migrated to Australia to start a new life in a democratic society, his comment to all of us, which is stuck in my mind, is that if one day you lose all your possessions and they take all your assets, the one thing they could never take away from you is your education. And that is something that has resonated with me all my life. And now you too have acquired something that no one can take away from you, however hard they try. So why am I giving this speech here today? Well, I've been working with Melbourne University for several years now in an area that I'm very passionate about, which is the provision of housing for all Australians, rich or poor. Professor Julie Wills, the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, and Professor Alan Pert thought I should share with you what I've been doing, as some of you might actually find it interesting. But before I get into that, in contemplating this speech, I looked back over my career and I must say I found the personal reflection quite revealing. We're not normally given a reason to reflect on our lives, to see if we can dig up something that we believe is interesting enough to share. Because when you live your life, you don't necessarily think that it's interesting to anyone else. As you've heard, I'm a civil engineer, I've got a postgraduate diploma in property and an MBA, but what I've never divulged to anybody is that my first burning ambition was to be an architect. You see, I've always loved building ever since I can remember. Be it building spaceships and cubby houses out of wooden boxes in the backyards, through to a career in property development which has spanned land subdivisions, large housing developments, all the way through to multi-storey commercial residential precincts like Freshwater Place and South Bank. I just love seeing things built and doing it as part of a broader team. You see, over time, I've come to realise that if you love what you do, you don't actually work many days in your life. As a young man, I was curious. I asked lots of questions. I found myself always stepping in areas outside my comfort zone, wanting to try new things, new ideas, without knowing what the outcome was going to be. And in preparing this speech, I've come to realise that curiosity was and still is one of the elements that keeps me inspired. I believe we need to constantly step out of our comfort zone to learn and grow as people. We need to push ourselves to think differently and keep trying new things. Make mistakes, make plenty of them, but use them as learning opportunities. I have a saying that I use quite often, which is, success is built upon a mountain of failures. Just don't do the same one twice. Too many people today are scared of making mistakes. They all want to know the answer to the question without asking it, or before asking it. And that gives rise, in my view, to the current state of play in terms of political populism. Behave authentically. Never, and I repeat, never compromise your own personal values for any company or individual. Along with your knowledge, your values are the only things that truly belong to you. And at this stage of my career, I have the luxury of deciding the people I want to work with because they share the same values as me. It makes my life much more enjoyable. So when you select an employer or create your own business, focus on the values and the culture of the organisation and make sure they are compatible with yours. I also held the view, and still do, that nothing is impossible. If you really want to do something, if you really believe in something, you can always find a way to make that happen. And I suspect this brings me to what I suspect both Julie and Alan wanted me to share with you today. During my role as General Manager, I was responsible for the development of 3 significant projects on public land, which started my involvement with social and affordable housing. Through the years, I engaged myself with Melbourne University and their work in the housing space, specifically on programs such as Transforming Housing and the Housing Expo. As part of that work, international experts would come over and talk to us about the development of their cities. At the time, I was also reading a number of publications discussing the economic impacts and benefits to the economy of well-located affordable housing. I distinctly remember the moment when a financier from New York called Mark Jarr delivered a presentation putting forward the view that affordable housing was considered to be key infrastructure for New York. That was my light bulb moment. From that point on, I realised that this was not just housing we were talking about. It was economic infrastructure for our city, just like roads, just like schools, just like hospitals. And when you take a moment to really think about it from a human perspective, how can anyone get their life in order and be productive to society if they do not have stable shelter? I've consequently formed a very clear and unambiguous view that unless we invest in more housing for all Australians, rich or poor, the long-term costs and economic consequences for our future will be huge. And you and your children will be the ones that will be paying for it. A lack of stable shelter will result in unintended consequences that will spill over into areas of mental health, family violence, police intervention, the justice system, and create a dependency on long-term welfare. The problem is becoming so big to solve that it scares every government. And guess what? They do nothing. So what happens? The problem gets bigger. My generation is leaving you with an intergenerational time bomb. So as silly and as daunting as it sounds, I've put together a single-page strategy on how we can try and change that, how we collectively can change that paradigm. I've titled it very simply, Housing All Australians. Its clear focus and objective is already resonating with a number of corporates and institutions, including Melbourne University, which is part of the reason I suspect why I'm probably here today. I believe that we've gone past waiting for governments to do things that we see as so obvious and make common sense. If we want things to change, then it's up to us to make that happen. Now, let me come back to that nothing is impossible belief that I mentioned earlier. One of the 4 pillars of the strategy started off as a discussion with my daughter. We were having coffee at a cafe in De Grave Street, just off Flinders Street. It was a time when the Grand Hall above Flinders Street Station was in the news because it had been vacant for 10 years. We were sitting there chatting. A homeless person came up to us and asked us for some money so he could get a bed for the night. For various reasons, I don't normally give money, but on that particular night we did. I said to my daughter, I can't believe that above the iconic symbol of Melbourne, which is Flinders Street Station, is a grand hall that's been empty for so long, and beneath it are people sleeping rough on the streets. It just didn't make sense to me. So I said to her, I wonder how many other buildings in Melbourne are empty and that could be used to provide shelter. Now, that was 2 years ago. And with persistence, and I've got to say a lot of persistence, and some very generous companies and individuals, exactly 1 week ago today to the hour, the Minister for Housing and the Governor of Victoria opened Melbourne's first pop-up shelter in South Melbourne. It had already been empty for 2 years and would have probably stayed empty for 5 to 6 years before redevelopment. This building is now managed by the YWCA and is housing homeless women over the age of 55. Another pop-up shelter was launched roughly 3 weeks ago in Sydney by the Uniting Church, in a building that was going to be empty for several years. And it too is housing homeless women over the age of 55. Given this is transitional housing, we estimate that over the period of the life of these buildings being vacant, we would house in excess of 150 to 200 women. And that's in 2 buildings. I think there are thousands of empty buildings across Australia. And the sad part of all that is that women over the age of 55 are the largest growing cohort of homelessness in Australia. Now just think about that. Opening the first pop-up shelter was a very, very satisfying day, but a very, very humble day. It made me realise, and I want you to realise, that as an individual, you can actually make a difference in this world. If you believe in something and have the persistence to see it through. So in closing, I would like to wish you all the success with your future. But I want you to not underestimate the gift of education. I want you to step outside your comfort zone and explore what the world has to offer. Make it your mission to try new and different things, and don't be worried about making mistakes. Ask questions. Be curious. Never underestimate your capacity to inspire others and through that change the world for the better. But to do that, you must find your passion. And if you're as lucky as me, you might not have to work many days in your life. And if I can leave you with some words of action from an Irish poet named W.B. Yeats. Do not wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking